Introduction. Close your eyes and imagine the scent of cinnamon, the warmth of black pepper, the exotic fragrance of cloves. For thousands of years, these simple flavors were worth more than gold, driving merchants across deserts, sailors across oceans, and empires into competition for control of the routes that carried them. Tonight, we journey along the ancient spice routes, networks of trade that connected East and West, that made fortunes and sparked wars, that brought distant cultures into contact and changed the world forever. This is a story of human desire, courage, greed, and the remarkable lengths people will go for something as simple as flavor. Settle in. Relax. And let's begin our journey in the warm islands of the Indonesian archipelago, where nutmeg and cloves once grew nowhere else on Earth. Chapter 1. The Spice Islands. Our story begins in one of the most remote and beautiful corners of the world, the Moluccas, tiny islands in eastern Indonesia that Europeans would call the Spice Islands. Here, in this volcanic archipelago surrounded by turquoise waters, grew treasures that would shape world history. Cloves grew only on a handful of islands, particularly Ternate, Tidore, and neighboring isles. These small, nail-shaped dried flower buds had an intense, sweet spicy flavor and aroma unlike anything else. Nutmeg and mace, the seed and its covering, grew only on the Banda Islands, an even smaller group. These tiny islands, collectively smaller than many modern cities, held a monopoly on spices Europe would desperately crave. Here's something remarkable. For thousands of years, no one outside Asia knew where these spices came from. Arab and Indian merchants who brought them westward kept the sources secret, protecting their lucrative trade. Europeans knew they wanted cloves and nutmeg but had no idea where they grew. The spices might as well have come from paradise itself, so mysterious were their origins. The islands themselves were tropical paradises, lush forests, pristine beaches, warm waters. The indigenous people had been cultivating and harvesting spices for generations, integrating them into their culture, medicine, and daily life. Cloves were used in traditional ceremonies, medicines, and even as breath fresheners. The islanders understood what they possessed was valuable but couldn't have imagined how much the wider world would covet their plants. Local kingdoms controlled the spice trade through the islands. Sultans of Ternate and Tidore ruled over the clove-producing islands, carefully managing production and trade. These were sophisticated societies with complex political relationships, trading networks extending throughout Southeast Asia, and cultural traditions influenced by Hindu, Buddhist, and eventually Islamic civilizations. Here's a detail about how valuable these spices were. In medieval Europe, a pound of nutmeg was worth more than a cow. A single sack of peppercorns could ransom a king. Cloves were literally worth their weight in gold. These tiny seeds and dried flowers, growing on islands most Europeans couldn't locate on a map, commanded prices that seem absurd today. Why were spices so valuable? Partly for flavor, medieval European food was often bland, and spices transformed dishes. Partly for preservation, spices helped mask the taste of spoiled meat or preserve food in an era before refrigeration. Partly for medicine, spices were believed to have medicinal properties, preventing disease and treating ailments. And partly for prestige, serving heavily spiced dishes demonstrated wealth and sophistication. But there was also simple supply and demand. Spices had to travel thousands of miles from their source, passing through multiple middlemen, each taking profit. By the time spices reached European markets, their prices had multiplied many times over. The remoteness and mystery of their origins added to their value. People will pay more for exotic unknowns than familiar commodities. Chapter 2: The ancient overland routes. Long before Europeans sought sea routes to the Spice Islands, spices traveled westward along ancient overland routes, paths through mountains, deserts, and kingdoms that connected Asia to the Mediterranean world. The earliest spice trade we know of dates back over 4,000 years. Archaeological evidence shows that cinnamon reached Egypt by 2000 BCE. Probably traveling from Southeast Asia through India and Arabia. Ancient Egyptian queens used cinnamon in perfumes and religious ceremonies. Pharaohs were buried with spices to accompany them to the afterlife. Here's a fascinating detail. Cinnamon is mentioned in the Old Testament and in ancient Chinese texts from around the same period. This means that over 3,000 years ago, cinnamon was being traded across Asia, from its source in Sri Lanka and southern India to China in one direction and Egypt in the other. The spice routes were already creating a connected ancient world. The trade worked through chains of middlemen. Spices might pass through a dozen different merchants' hands between source and final destination. Producers in Southeast Asia sold to Malay traders, who sold to Indian merchants, who sold to Arab traders, who sold to Mediterranean merchants, who finally sold to European customers. Each link in the chain added cost and kept the ultimate sources secret. Arab merchants controlled much of the trade for centuries. They transported spices by camel caravan across Arabian deserts, along the incense route through Yemen and up the Arabian Peninsula. The journey was arduous, months crossing harsh deserts, navigating by stars, moving from oasis to oasis, protecting caravans from bandits. Here's what a spice caravan might have looked like: hundreds of camels laden with sacks, moving in long trains across empty landscapes. Merchants traveled in groups for safety. A single caravan might include merchants from different cities, all sharing the journey's risks and costs. They employed guards, guides who knew the routes, and local intermediaries to negotiate safe passage through different kingdoms. The overland routes weren't single paths but networks of interconnecting roads. From India, spices might travel northwest through Persia to the Mediterranean, or north through Central Asia along the Silk Road to China and Mongolia. Multiple routes provided options but also complexity. Political instability in one region redirected trade to alternatives. Ancient Rome was the first major Western consumer of Asian spices. By the 1st century CE, Roman ships were sailing directly to India, using monsoon winds to cross the Arabian Sea. This direct trade bypassed some middlemen, reducing costs. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder complained that Romans spent enormous sums importing luxuries from the East, draining gold from the empire. Here's a specific example of Roman spice consumption. Black pepper from southern India was so popular that Romans used it in almost every dish, much as we use salt today. When Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome in 410 CE, part of his ransom demand included 3,000 pounds of pepper. Spice wasn't just luxury, it was currency and strategic resource. After Rome's fall, Byzantine Constantinople became the major Western terminus for spice trade. The Byzantine Empire maintained trade relationships with Persia and India, ensuring spices continued flowing westward. Byzantine cuisine featured heavily spiced dishes, and Byzantine nobles displayed their wealth through elaborate feasts showcasing exotic spices. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE transformed the spice trade. Muslim Arab traders expanded across North Africa, the Middle East, and into Central and South Asia. They established trading networks across this vast region, with Arabic becoming the lingua franca of commerce. Muslim merchants dominated the spice trade for centuries, controlling both overland and maritime routes. Chapter 3: The Medieval Spice Trade. By the medieval period, spices had become central to European cuisine, medicine, and culture. Yet Europeans remained dependent on intermediaries, with no direct access to spice sources. This dependency would eventually drive European exploration, but for centuries the system worked, expensively but effectively. Venice became Europe's spice capital. Venetian merchants established relationships with Arab and Byzantine traders, bringing spices from Alexandria and Constantinople to Venice, then distributing them throughout Europe. Venice grew immensely wealthy from this trade, becoming one of medieval Europe's richest cities. Here's how the Venetian system worked. Venetian galleys, long, sleek ships powered by oars and sails, sailed to Alexandria or Beirut. There, they purchased spices from Arab merchants who'd brought them from India or Southeast Asia. The galleys returned to Venice, where the spices were stored in warehouses, then sold to merchants from all over Europe. Venice controlled this trade carefully, maintaining its monopoly and profits. The prices were extraordinary. A pound of saffron, technically not a spice but treated as one, cost the same as a horse. Ginger, cinnamon, and pepper were measured carefully, often sold in tiny quantities. Merchants who specialized in spices, called peppers in England, were among the wealthiest businessmen. The Grocers' Guild, which handled spices, was one of the most prestigious in medieval cities. Spices were displayed prominently to showcase wealth. Medieval banquets for nobility featured dishes heavily laden with spices, whole peppercorns visible in sauces, cinnamon and clove scenting meats, ginger flavoring pastries. The conspicuous use of expensive spices demonstrated the host's wealth and generosity. Here's a curious medieval belief: spices were thought to balance bodily humors, the medieval medical theory that health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids. Different spices had different properties, some were hot, others cold, some wet, others dry. Physicians prescribed spices as medicine, and wealthy people consumed them as health supplements. Medieval Europeans also believed spices grew near the Garden of Eden. Since they didn't know where spices actually came from, they imagined them coming from paradise, from lands of eternal summer and magical abundance. This mythological geography reinforced spices' exotic appeal and justified their high prices. The Crusades, paradoxically, increased European appetite for spices. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought tastes for Middle Eastern cuisine, which featured spices more heavily than European food. They also brought back more spices, introducing Europeans to varieties they hadn't encountered before. The Crusades strengthened rather than weakened the spice trade. Genoa, Venice's rival, also participated in the spice trade but never achieved Venice's dominance. The competition between these two Italian city-states sometimes erupted into warfare, with control of spice trade routes as a major prize. In 1381, Venice and Genoa fought a war partly over trading privileges in the eastern Mediterranean. Here's an interesting detail about medieval spice use. Despite the modern myth, spices weren't primarily used to mask rotten meat. Medieval people knew rotten meat was dangerous and had methods to preserve meat through salting, smoking, and drying. Spices were luxury items used to demonstrate wealth and create impressive flavors, not to cover up spoilage. By the 14th century, the spice trade had created a global economy of sorts. Spices grown in Southeast Asia traveled through India, Arabia, and Egypt to Venice, then throughout Europe. Chinese silks traveled west, European silver and gold traveled east. This trade connected distant civilizations, spreading not just goods but ideas, technologies, and diseases. Chapter 4: The Ottoman Challenge. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and gaining control of strategic trade routes between Asia and Europe. This event would have profound consequences for the spice trade and would eventually drive European exploration. The Ottomans didn't cut off the spice trade, they needed the customs revenue. But they did control it, charging taxes and tariffs on goods passing through their territory. Venetian merchants continued buying spices in Ottoman ports, but costs increased, and the relationship was now between rivals rather than partners. Here's what made the situation uncomfortable for Europeans: they were now entirely dependent on a Muslim empire for their most desired luxury goods. Religious tensions from the Crusades hadn't disappeared. European Christians and Ottoman Muslims viewed each other with suspicion and hostility, yet needed each other economically. This created pressure to find alternative routes to Asia that bypassed Ottoman territory. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt also controlled crucial routes, managing the Red Sea trade from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Spices arriving in Egypt from India were transported overland to Alexandria or up the Nile, then shipped to European markets. The Mamluks carefully managed this trade, knowing it was their economic lifeblood. Portuguese merchants and princes began asking, what if we could sail directly to the spice sources, bypassing all these middlemen? If we could reach India or even the Spice Islands by sea, we could purchase spices at source prices, bringing them home and selling them at enormous profit. The question was, how? The Islamic world had its own sophisticated spice trade networks. Muslim merchants had been sailing between Arabia, East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia for centuries. They understood monsoon wind patterns, allowing predictable seasonal sailing. They had established trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean, creating a maritime network that connected distant regions. Here's something important: the Islamic spice trade was generally peaceful commerce. Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and later Christian merchants all participated. Trading ports were cosmopolitan, multilingual cities where different cultures mixed. The spice trade created zones of cultural exchange and relative tolerance. Profit mattered more than religious differences. European Christians, however, imagined reaching Asia and converting it to Christianity while breaking Muslim trade dominance. This combination of religious mission and commercial ambition would drive the age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, who sponsored early explorations down the African coast in the 15th century, was motivated by both impulses. The fall of Constantinople also had an unintended consequence. Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing manuscripts and knowledge. This helped spark the Renaissance and spread geographic knowledge. Europeans began studying ancient texts about distant lands, including Ptolemy's geography, which described the known world. This knowledge, combined with improved navigation technology, made long-distance sea voyages feasible. By the mid-15th century, European technology had improved significantly. Better ships, particularly the Portuguese caravel, which could sail closer to the wind, made ocean voyages safer. The magnetic compass, adopted from China via the Islamic world, improved navigation. Improvements in cartography created better maps. Europeans were ready to attempt voyages their ancestors couldn't have imagined. Chapter 5: The Portuguese pioneers. Portugal, a small kingdom on Europe's western edge, would become the first European nation to reach the spice sources directly. This achievement required determination, courage, and decades of gradual exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, son of Portugal's king, established a navigation school and sponsored expeditions along Africa's west coast in the early 1400s. His explorers pushed gradually southward, mapping the African coastline, establishing trading posts, and learning from experience. Each expedition went a bit farther than the previous one. Here's a crucial question these explorers faced: did Africa have an end? Did the continent extend infinitely southward, or could you sail around it to reach the Indian Ocean? Ancient writers disagreed, and medieval Europeans simply didn't know. The Portuguese had to find out by sailing ever southward, year after year. In 1488, Bartolomé Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans connected. This was a monumental discovery. A sea route to Asia was possible. Dias wanted to continue, but his crew, exhausted and frightened by the storms around the Cape, forced him to turn back. 9 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama led 4 ships on a voyage that would change history. He sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, up Africa's east coast, then across the Indian Ocean to Calicut on India's southwestern coast. He reached India by sea, the first European to do so since ancient times. Here's what da Gama encountered in Calicut: a sophisticated trading port with merchants from across the Indian Ocean, dealing in spices, textiles, and precious goods. The local Hindu ruler, the Zammarin, welcomed foreign traders. Arabs, Chinese, and others had been coming for centuries. Da Gama was just another foreign merchant, arriving by an unusual route. But da Gama's gifts, cloth, honey, and hats, seemed pathetically inadequate compared to the gold and silver other merchants brought. Muslim merchants in Calicut, seeing Portuguese as potential competitors, advised the Zammarin that these foreigners weren't worth trading with. Da Gama managed to acquire some spices, but the trading was difficult and tense. Nevertheless, da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499 with spices purchased at Indian prices, a tiny fraction of what they cost in Venice. Even after losing half his crew to disease and storms, even with the small quantity he brought back, the voyage was profitable. More importantly, it proved the route was feasible. Portugal immediately began exploiting this discovery. Within a few years, Portuguese fleets were sailing to India annually. They established fortified trading posts along India's coast, in East Africa, and eventually in Southeast Asia. They used military force to intimidate rivals and secure favorable trading terms. Here's how Portuguese strategy worked. They didn't conquer large territories. Portugal lacked the population and resources for that. Instead, they established fortified trading posts at strategic locations, maintained naval superiority through superior ships and cannon, and forced local rulers to grant trading privileges. It was maritime empire, controlling sea routes rather than land territories. Afonso de Albuquerque, Portuguese viceroy in the early 1500s, was the architect of this strategy. He captured strategic ports, Goa in India, 1510, Malacca in Malaysia, 1511, and Hormuz controlling the Persian Gulf, 1515. These bases gave Portugal control of major trade routes. From Malacca, the Portuguese could reach the Spice Islands themselves. In 1512, Portuguese ships reached the Moluccas, the actual Spice Islands. Europeans had finally reached the source. The Portuguese established treaties with local sultans, built a fortress on Ternate, and began shipping cloves and nutmeg directly to Lisbon. The Portuguese century had begun. Chapter 6: Global Competition. Portugal's success didn't go unnoticed. Other European nations wanted their share of the spice trade. This competition would reshape global politics for centuries. Spain, Portugal's neighbor and rival, had pursued a different strategy. Accepting Portuguese dominance of the route around Africa, Spain sponsored Christopher Columbus's attempt to reach Asia by sailing west. Columbus didn't reach Asia, he encountered the Americas instead, but Spain claimed this new world and began exploiting it. Here's an interesting consequence. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the entire world between them. Drawing an imaginary line through the Atlantic, they agreed that everything west of the line belonged to Spain, everything east to Portugal. Pope Alexander VI blessed this arrangement. Two small European kingdoms had divided the globe, and the rest of Europe was expected to accept it. But the treaty had an ambiguity. Where did the line fall on the opposite side of the world, in Asia? This became important when Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator employed by Spain, proposed sailing west to reach the Spice Islands. If he could find a western route, Spain could claim the Spice Islands fell on their side of the line. Magellan's expedition, 1519 to 1522, was one of history's most extraordinary voyages. He sailed west, found a passage through South America, the Strait of Magellan, crossed the Pacific, which Europeans hadn't known existed, reached the Philippines, where he was killed in a local conflict, but his crew continued to the Spice Islands, loaded spices, and sailed home via the Indian Ocean and around Africa. One ship, the Victoria, with just 18 survivors of the original 270 crew, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. They brought back enough spices to pay for the entire expedition, despite losing 4 ships and most of the men. This proved that the world was round, though most educated people already knew this, and that spices were valuable enough to justify even this extraordinary journey. The Dutch, who were under Spanish rule in the 16th century, initially participated in the spice trade through Portugal and Spain. But when the Dutch rebelled against Spanish rule in the 1560s, they were cut off from official channels. This forced them to create their own route to Asia. Here's how the Dutch succeeded. In 1602, multiple Dutch trading companies merged into the Dutch East India Company, VOC, which received a government-granted monopoly on Dutch trade with Asia. The VOC had extraordinary powers. It could wage war, negotiate treaties, and govern territories. It was a commercial company that functioned like a sovereign state. the VOC pursued an aggressive strategy in Southeast Asia. They conquered Portuguese trading posts, made alliances with local rulers, and used force to control spice production. In the Banda Islands, they massacred or enslaved most of the native population and replaced them with Dutch colonists who would produce nutmeg under VOC control. The brutality of VOC policies in the Spice Islands was extraordinary. Here's a specific example. The VOC limited nutmeg production to specific islands they controlled, then destroyed nutmeg trees on other islands to maintain their monopoly. Anyone caught growing or smuggling nutmeg faced severe punishment, including execution. The VOC's monopoly was enforced through terror as well as commerce. Meanwhile, the English were also entering the spice trade. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I chartered the English East India Company, granting it monopoly rights on English trade with Asia. The English initially tried to compete directly with the Dutch in the Spice Islands but found themselves outmatched by VOC's military and commercial power. A turning point came in 1623 at the Amboina massacre, when Dutch authorities in the Moluccas executed 10 English merchants and several Japanese and Portuguese traders, accusing them of conspiracy. Whether the conspiracy was real or fabricated remains debated, but the result was clear: the English withdrew from the Spice Islands, leaving them to Dutch control. Instead, the English East India Company focused on India. This shift would eventually prove far more valuable than the spice trade. India became the heart of the British Empire, while the Dutch controlled the Indonesian spice trade. Both nations became wealthy, but British India would ultimately be more significant than Dutch Indonesia. Chapter 7: The Spice Monopolies. For nearly 2 centuries, European trading companies maintained monopolistic control over the spice trade, using any means necessary to protect their profits. This period shows both the extraordinary reach of European commercial power and the brutal methods used to maintain it. The Dutch VOC's control of the Spice Islands was nearly absolute. They limited production, fixed prices, and punished anyone who tried to break their monopoly. This kept spice prices high in Europe, generating enormous profits. Between 1602 and 1799, the VOC paid an average annual dividend of 18%, extraordinary returns that made VOC shares some of the most valuable investments in Europe. Here's how the monopoly system worked. The VOC contracted with local rulers to purchase entire harvests at fixed prices. They then shipped spices to Amsterdam, where they were stored in vast warehouses and sold at auction to European merchants. By controlling supply, they could keep prices artificially high. Some years, when spices were too abundant, the VOC would burn surplus stock rather than let prices fall. The VOC also maintained military force throughout Southeast Asia, fortresses, armed ships, and soldiers who protected Dutch interests. This military presence allowed them to enforce contracts, intimidate rivals, and suppress smuggling. The line between commerce and empire blurred. The VOC was simultaneously a trading company and a colonial power. Life on VOC ships was harsh. Sailors signed on for voyages that might last years, with high mortality from disease, storms, and combat. Food was often spoiled, water stagnant, discipline brutal. Yet young men signed up anyway, dreaming of adventure and the possibility of enrichment. Some did return wealthy, many never returned at all. Here's a detail about the VOC's efficiency. They developed standardized procedures for everything: ship design, cargo handling, accounting methods, training. The VOC was one of the world's first truly modern corporations, pioneering practices like joint stock ownership, standardized contracts, and systematic record-keeping. Their business methods were as revolutionary as their military tactics. The English East India Company pursued a different model in India. Rather than focusing solely on spices, they traded in textiles, indigo, saltpeter, and eventually opium. They established factories, fortified trading posts, in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, gradually expanding their influence inland. The French also established their own East India Company, competing with the Dutch and English in India and Southeast Asia. French influence was never as dominant as Dutch or English, but French trading posts in India, particularly Pondicherry, remained significant for centuries. Competition between these European powers occasionally erupted into warfare. The Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th century involved naval battles partly over trade routes and colonies. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, saw English and French forces fighting in India as well as Europe and North America, with control of trade as a major prize. Here's an ironic outcome: the intense competition and warfare over spices ultimately diminished their value. As more sources became available and production increased, spice prices gradually fell. Spices that had once been worth their weight in gold became affordable to ordinary people. The monopolies that seemed so valuable in the 1600s were less profitable by the 1700s. Meanwhile, other tropical products became more important to European trade: sugar from the Caribbean, coffee from Arabia and later the Americas, tea from China and India, cotton textiles from India. The spice trade continued but was no longer the primary driver of European expansion in Asia. Chapter 8: Breaking the Monopolies. The monopoly on spices couldn't last forever. Eventually, spice plants were smuggled out of their original locations and cultivated elsewhere, breaking the geographic monopolies that had sustained high prices. Pierre Poivre, a French botanist and colonial administrator, made it his mission to break the Dutch monopoly on cloves and nutmeg. In the 1770s, he organized expeditions to secretly acquire clove and nutmeg seedlings from the Dutch-controlled Spice Islands and transplant them to French colonies in the Indian Ocean, particularly Mauritius and Réunion. Here's how the smuggling was accomplished. Small boats would approach Indonesian islands at night. Their crew would slip ashore, dig up seedlings, wrap the roots carefully, smuggle them back to the boat, and sail away before being discovered. It was dangerous. Dutch authorities would execute smugglers if caught, but the potential rewards were enormous. Poivre succeeded. By the 1770s, cloves and nutmeg were growing in French colonies. The Dutch monopoly was broken, at least partially. Within decades, these spices were also being cultivated in Zanzibar, cloves, Grenada, nutmeg, and other tropical colonies. Production increased, prices fell, and the strategic importance of the original Spice Islands diminished. The Dutch VOC, facing declining profits, increasing costs, and corruption within its ranks, went bankrupt in 1799. The Dutch government took over its territories, but the era of the great trading companies was ending. The 19th century would see direct colonial administration replace the commercial empire model. Here's another factor in the monopoly's decline: the Industrial Revolution created new sources of wealth. Manufacturing, coal, iron, railroads, and steam power generated profits that dwarfed spice trade returns. Investors who once coveted VOC shares were now buying railroad stocks and industrial bonds. Spices became just another commodity rather than the supreme luxury they'd once been. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 revolutionized trade routes once again. Ships could now travel between Europe and Asia without sailing around Africa, cutting journey times dramatically. This made trade more efficient but also less dependent on any particular route or choke point. The geographic advantages that had made certain locations strategically valuable became less important. By the late 19th century, anyone with money could buy spices easily. Pepper, once worth more than silver, was on every table. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, all were available in ordinary stores at affordable prices. The democratization of spices was complete. What had once been aristocratic luxuries had become ordinary seasonings. The Spice Islands themselves, having lost their monopoly, became backwaters. The wealth that had flowed through them for centuries now went elsewhere. The islands that had drawn Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English into competition were now quiet colonial outposts, their historical significance largely forgotten except by scholars. Chapter 9: The Cultural Legacy. Though the spice trade's economic importance declined, its cultural legacy endures. The spice routes transformed cuisines, languages, and entire cultures across the world. European cuisine was fundamentally changed by Asian spices. Medieval European food was heavily spiced. Modern European food generally uses spices more subtly. But the availability of pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger permanently altered European cooking. These spices, once exotic luxuries, became standard ingredients. Here's an interesting linguistic legacy. Many English words related to commerce come from the spice trade. Pepper comes from Sanskrit through Latin. Ginger comes from Sanskrit through Greek and Latin. Cinnamon derives from Hebrew and Greek. Cloves comes from Latin clavis, nail, describing their shape. These words traveled along trade routes just as the spices themselves did. The spice trade also created lasting connections between distant cultures. Arab merchants married into Indian communities. Portuguese mixed with Southeast Asians, creating mixed populations in Goa, Malacca, and elsewhere. Dutch settlers in Indonesia formed communities that would eventually become distinct ethnic groups. The spice trade was an engine of globalization long before the term existed. Cuisines around the world incorporate spices that traveled along ancient trade routes. Indian cuisine's complex spicing influenced Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern, and East African cooking. Chinese cuisine adopted spices from Southeast Asian and Indian sources. European baking traditions use cinnamon and nutmeg in ways that would have been impossible before the spice trade. Here's a specific example: the holiday cookies and pastries of Northern Europe, gingerbread, speculoos, lebkuchen, all feature spices that once came from Asia via the spice routes. These Christmas traditions are directly descended from medieval displays of spice-based wealth, now so common that we forget their exotic origins. The spice trade also created architectural legacies. VOC warehouses still stand in Amsterdam, massive brick buildings where spices were stored before auction. Portuguese forts dot the coasts of India, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. Colonial architecture in Goa, Malacca, and the Indonesian islands reflects centuries of European presence driven by spice trade. Museums around the world preserve spice trade artifacts, ships' logs describing voyages, trading company records, navigational instruments, samples of preserved spices, paintings of trading ports. These materials allow us to reconstruct the spice trade in detail, understanding both its daily reality and its grand sweep. The spice trade also left a darker legacy: colonialism, exploitation, slavery, and cultural destruction. European control of spice trade led to conquest and colonization throughout Asia. Indigenous peoples were displaced, enslaved, or killed. Traditional cultures were disrupted or destroyed. This legacy of exploitation and its consequences persist in post-colonial tensions and inequalities. Here's an important point: the spice trade demonstrates how human desires for simple pleasures, flavor, aroma, variety, can drive enormous historical forces. The want for cinnamon and pepper led to global exploration, the rise and fall of empires, technological innovation, and cultural exchange. Something as simple as seasoning food had world historical consequences. Chapter 10: Spices in the Modern World Today. The spice trade continues, though transformed beyond anything medieval merchants would recognize. Spices are global commodities, produced in dozens of countries and consumed worldwide. India is now the world's largest producer and consumer of spices, growing everything from pepper and cardamom to turmeric and cumin. Indian spice markets, colorful, fragrant, bustling, are direct descendants of the markets that supplied Arab and European traders centuries ago. The continuity across millennia is remarkable. Indonesia, home of the original spice islands, remains a major spice producer. Nutmeg and cloves are still grown in the Moluccas, though now they're also cultivated in Grenada, Zanzibar, and elsewhere. The monopoly is long gone, but the tradition continues. Here's an interesting modern development: many spices are now cultivated far from their original homes. Black pepper, originally from India's Malabar coast, is now grown in Vietnam, which has become the world's largest pepper exporter. Cinnamon comes from Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and China. Cloves come from Indonesia, Madagascar, and Tanzania. Globalization has spread spice cultivation worldwide. The value of spices has inverted. Pepper, once precious, is now one of the cheapest spices. Meanwhile, saffron, which was expensive but available in medieval times, is now the world's most expensive spice by weight, costing more than gold. Vanilla, unknown to medieval Europeans, is now expensive due to labor-intensive cultivation and processing. Modern spice trade is industrialized. Spices are harvested, processed, tested for quality and purity, packaged, and shipped in standardized containers. Major food companies purchase spices by the ton. Home cooks buy small jars at supermarkets. The romance is gone, but efficiency has made spices accessible to everyone. Food safety regulations now govern spice trade. Spices must be tested for contaminants, properly labeled, and meet quality standards. The European Union, United States, and other major markets have strict requirements. This protects consumers but also creates barriers for small producers in developing countries. Here's a contemporary issue: fair trade and organic spices represent attempts to address inequalities in global spice trade. Small-scale spice farmers often receive very little of the final price consumers pay. Fair trade certification aims to ensure farmers receive fairer compensation. Organic certification addresses pesticide use and environmental concerns. The spice trade still matters economically to producing countries. For small nations like Grenada, spices remain significant exports. For regions within larger countries, Kerala in India, Zanzibar in Tanzania, spices provide important income. The economic importance has declined relatively, but spices still support millions of farmers and workers. Spice tourism has become an industry. Visitors tour spice plantations in Kerala, Zanzibar, and Grenada, learning how spices grow and are processed. Historical sites related to the spice trade, Portuguese forts in Goa, VOC buildings in Malacca, spice warehouses in Amsterdam, attract tourists interested in this history. The spice trade's legacy generates revenue through heritage tourism. Chapter 11, Lessons from the Spice Routes. What can we learn from the centuries-long story of the spice routes? Several profound lessons emerge from this history. First, human desire drives exploration and innovation. The want for spices motivated some of history's most daring voyages. Portuguese sailors ventured into unknown waters, risking storms, disease, and hostile encounters because spices awaited at journey's end. This pattern repeats throughout history. Desire for luxury, profit, or advantage drives people to attempt seemingly impossible things. Second, trade connects distant cultures, for better and worse. The spice routes brought people from different continents into contact, exchanging not just goods but ideas, technologies, and diseases. These connections enriched cultures but also enabled exploitation. Trade creates interdependence, which can be peaceful or violent depending on power relationships. Here's a third lesson: monopolies eventually fail. Despite ruthless enforcement, despite military power, despite executing smugglers and burning surplus stock, the Dutch couldn't maintain their spice monopoly forever. Information spreads, plants can be transplanted, competitors find alternatives. This truth applies to modern monopolies as well. No market dominance lasts forever. Fourth, value is contextual and changes over time. Pepper once worth more than gold is now cheap. Spices that justified warfare and exploration are now ordinary seasonings. What seems precious in one era becomes commonplace in another. This suggests humility about our own values. What we consider essential or luxurious might seem ordinary or absurd to future generations. Fifth, geography shapes but doesn't determine history. The Spice Islands' isolation gave them monopoly for centuries, but eventually that monopoly was broken. The Mediterranean's position between Europe and Asia made it commercially important, but the opening of sea routes around Africa changed everything. Geography creates opportunities and constraints, but human ingenuity finds ways to overcome geographic limitations. Here's a sixth lesson: the powerful often exploit the weak, but exploitation carries costs. European trading companies extracted wealth from Asia, often through violence and coercion. This enriched Europe but created lasting resentments and inequalities. The colonial legacy of the spice trade still affects former colonies' relationships with former colonizers. Exploitation may profit the exploiter in the short term, but creates long-term problems. 7th, technological change transforms trade. Better ships, navigation tools, and eventually steam power and the Suez Canal continually reshape the spice trade. Today, refrigeration, containerization, and air freight have transformed trade again. Staying competitive requires adapting to technological change, whether in the 16th century or the 21st. 8th, cultural exchange enriches but also disrupts. The spice trade introduced Europeans to Asian flavors, Asians to European goods, creating richer, more diverse cultures. But this exchange also disrupted traditional practices, displaced local producers, and homogenized global culture. Exchange is inevitable and generally beneficial, but it comes with costs. Chapter 12: The Spice Routes Today. While the ancient spice routes' specific paths are history, the patterns they established continue in modern global trade. Understanding these connections helps us see contemporary trade in historical perspective. Modern shipping routes still connect Asia to Europe and the Americas, carrying not spices but electronics, manufactured goods, and containers full of diverse products. The Strait of Malacca, which was strategic in the spice trade era, remains one of the world's most important maritime choke points. Over a quarter of global trade passes through it. Here's a modern parallel: oil has replaced spices as the commodity that drives global politics and warfare. Nations compete for oil access, control oil-producing regions, and build military presence around oil routes. The geopolitics of oil resembles the geopolitics of spices. Strategic resources motivate power projection and competition. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure project, consciously invokes the historical Silk Road and spice routes. China is building ports, roads, and railroads connecting Asia to Europe and Africa, recreating overland and maritime trade routes similar to those that carried spices centuries ago. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Cultural globalization continues the mixing that spice trade began. Today, Thai cuisine is popular in Sweden, Mexican food in Japan, Italian restaurants exist everywhere. This culinary globalization descends directly from the spice trade's cultural exchange. We take for granted the availability of diverse cuisines, forgetting how recently this was impossible. Here's something remarkable: you can buy any spice from anywhere in the world with a few clicks on a smartphone. Medieval merchants spent months traveling dangerous routes to acquire spices. We receive them in days. This convenience is historically unprecedented and easy to take for granted. The spice routes also established patterns of inequality that persist. Many former colonies remain economically dependent on exporting raw materials, whether spices, minerals, or agricultural products, to wealthy nations. The colonial relationships established during the spice trade era have evolved but haven't disappeared. Global inequality partly reflects these historical patterns. Modern fair trade movements try to address these inequalities, ensuring spice farmers receive fair compensation and work in humane conditions. These efforts acknowledge that the spice trade's legacy includes exploitation that should be rectified, not just celebrated. Tourism to historical spice route sites helps preserve this heritage. When people visit the Moluccas, tour spice plantations, or walk through Portuguese forts in Goa, they're connecting with this history. Heritage tourism helps former colonies monetize their history while educating visitors about how the modern world was shaped. closing, reflections on the spice routes. As you settle into sleep, let's reflect on this remarkable journey we've taken together. From the spice islands of Indonesia to the markets of Venice, from Portuguese caravels rounding Africa to Dutch ships dominating the seas, from medieval monopolies to modern globalization, the spice routes have shaped our world in ways we often don't recognize. Think about the courage of those early sailors who ventured into unknown waters, navigating by stars and dead reckoning, not knowing what lay beyond the horizon. They risked everything for the possibility of profit and glory. Some found fortune, many found only death in storms or strange diseases. Yet they kept sailing, kept exploring, kept pushing the boundaries of the known world. Consider the merchants who organized these voyages, who invested fortunes in expeditions that might never return, who built trading networks spanning continents. They were motivated by profit, certainly, but also by curiosity, ambition, and the human urge to connect with distant places and peoples. Think about the spice growers in the Moluccas, whose plants attracted global attention they never sought. Their islands became contested territory, their societies disrupted by foreign powers seeking control of cloves and nutmeg. The spice trade brought wealth to some but suffering to many. Here's something to contemplate as you drift toward sleep: a pinch of cinnamon in your coffee, a dash of nutmeg in a dessert, black pepper on your dinner. These simple flavors carry centuries of history. Every spice has a story of voyages and trade, of desire and danger, of cultural exchange and colonial violence. The spice routes remind us that history is driven not just by kings and battles but by ordinary human desires, for flavor, for variety, for the exotic. Something as simple as wanting food to taste better motivated exploration that mapped the world, trade that connected civilizations, and conflicts that reshaped political boundaries. The routes also remind us that globalization isn't new. 1,500 years ago, spices were traveling from Indonesia to Rome. 1,000 years ago, Arab merchants were connecting 3 continents through trade. 500 years ago, European ships were sailing to Asia and back. The world has been interconnected for far longer than we sometimes realize. But the spice routes also remind us of imperialism's costs. The wealth Europe extracted from Asia came at terrible cost to colonized peoples. The fortunes made in the spice trade were built partly on exploitation, slavery, and violence. This darker side of the story shouldn't be forgotten, even as we acknowledge the trade's fascinating aspects. As you rest, imagine the scent of cloves drying in tropical sun, the sight of cinnamon bark being peeled from trees, the fragrance of cardamom pods being sorted at a market. These sensory experiences connected people across vast distances, made fortunes and sparked wars, fed billions and changed history. The spice routes are history, but their legacy continues every time we season food, every time we taste flavors from distant places, every time we benefit from global trade. We're all inheritors of this history, participants in the global exchange that spices initiated centuries ago. Sleep well, knowing that the simple spices in your kitchen carry extraordinary stories. Rest peacefully, dreaming perhaps of distant islands, of ships with billowing sails, of caravans crossing deserts, of merchants haggling in bustling ports, of all the human drama that unfolded over something as simple as flavor. Good night. May your dreams be filled with exotic fragrances, distant horizons, and the remarkable story of how humanity's desire for spices helped create the connected world we inhabit today.